Director of the Program in Public Law and the Academic Director of the Bolch Judicial Institute right over at Duke Law School. And I am absolutely delighted today to be here to introduce Justice Susan Glazebrook of the Supreme Court of New Zealand. So Justice Glazebrook is visiting Duke this week as our distinguished judge in residence at the Bolch Judicial Institute. And on Wednesday evening, she was the keynote speaker at our annual award ceremony for the Bolch Prize for the Rule of Law, which she accepted on behalf of the International Association of Women Judges, for which she serves as president. This is the last program of Justice Glazebrook's astonishingly busy schedule this week, and we are so grateful to her for her willingness to spend so much time talking with so many people around campus about her important work. Now, a little bit of biography. So Justice Glazebrook has been a member of the Supreme Court of New Zealand since 2012. Before that, she served on the country's High Court and Court of Appeal. She is a graduate of the University of Auckland and holds a doctorate of philosophy from the University of Oxford. Prior to her appointment to the bench, Justice Glazebrook was a partner in the firm Simpson Grierson, where she specialized in tax and finance law. And she has served as president of the Inter-Pacific Bar Association on the Advisory Council of Jurists for the Asia-Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions, and, as if that weren't enough, as chair, the Institute of Judicial Studies, the body responsible for judicial education in New Zealand. She currently chairs a cross-bench committee looking at ways to make the courts in New Zealand more inclusive. And she is the president of the International Association of Women Judges, an organization of over 6,500 members dedicated to the promotion of the rule of law, to gender equality, and to access to justice. In 2014, she was made a Dame Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to the judiciary. So Justice Glazebrook is here today to speak specifically about the International Association of Women Judges' efforts to evacuate and resettle the women judges of Afghanistan after the Taliban retook power in August of 2021. This is the work that we honored at the Bolch Prize program on Wednesday, and as you will hear today, it is truly remarkable work. So by way of background, the Bolch Prize for the Rule of Law is an award given annually by the Bolch Judicial Institute, which works to strengthen, support, and advance the rule of law here at home as well as internationally. And we do this through scholarship and research, reform efforts, judicial education, programs and publications that build civic awareness and improve our understanding of the judiciary and judicial administration, and through the Bolch Prize, which celebrates these individuals and organizations that do the extraordinary work of protecting the rule of law, improving the administration of justice, and working toward our shared goal of equal justice for all. The IAWJ is an incredible example of this type of work. So many of you will remember the chaotic days of late summer in 2021, when our news programs were consumed by images of people crowding the airport in Kabul, Afghanistan, hoping to get out of the country before the Western forces were gone and the Taliban had regained control. The women judges of Afghanistan had much to fear during these times. Even though the country had been working since the early 2000s to build a democracy and had begun to allow women to pursue education and careers, the women who were able to become judges still faced discrimination and threats from defendants in their courtrooms and even from people with whom they worked. They were battling years of oppression and a culture that expected women to defer to men, to stay in the home, and to stay out of the public eye. Women judges had defied these expectations and had dared to sit in judgment of men. Under the Taliban regime, these were unacceptable and punishable acts. The International Association of Women Judges had been working with Afghanistan's women since 2003, developing educational and leadership training opportunities and exchange and mentoring programs. The IAWJ knew these women judges well, and they knew well the threats that they would face under Taliban leadership. So as Kabul finally fell on August 15, 2021, the IAWJ had already mobilized a global network of women judges and partners to provide help, guidance, and funding to get women judges out of Afghanistan and to help them find permanent homes in new countries. Thanks to the tireless efforts of IAWJ, more than 200 judges have been safely evacuated and 150 have been permanently resettled. In just a moment, Justice Glazebrook is going to share more about this extraordinary effort. But first, we would like to share with you a short film that was produced for our Bolch Prize ceremony. The film gives an overview of the crisis facing Afghan women judges and the work that is still to be done. And I should warn you, this is a wonderful film, but it does have some difficult moments, and there is some gunfire, so I just want everyone to be aware. Thank you.
Afghans are thronging to Kabul's airport, desperate to get on planes and leave the country at any cost.
Crowds storming the runway, chasing down planes in an attempt to board.
Restrictions on human rights, particularly against women and girls, with the Taliban now effectively in control.
But at least 220 women judges in Afghanistan are in hiding. And the men that they sent to prison in the past are now threatening to kill them.
I received many calls from a criminal who I put him in the jail. He was killed his young wife. He at the end of the trial, he just stand and look at me and said, "Hey woman, I'm a member of Taliban, and when I get out of jail, I can do what I did with my wife."
حالا زمانی که طالب آمدن تمام محبوسین رها شدن و بسا بزرگترین تهدید برای من هم شوهرهای خانم‌هایی است که
people who were working with foreigners are considered as betrayers. When you are from a minority, there is no mercy.
They were women that we saw as having immense courage and dedication to the rule of law. We vowed, again very naively, that we would not forget anyone, we would leave no one behind.
You know, some people always say, well, why did you pick the judges? Well, we didn't pick the judges. The judges were part of who we were. And it was that sense of sisterhood that I was so grateful for.
I have pictures of the judges who already had boarding passes to go into the plane, and then the whole thing was full. It was just heartbreaking.
We naively thought we just had to tell the story and it would be so obvious that the judges were at such risk, the women judges were at such risk, that they would be immediately put on the plane.
The adage, women and children into the lifeboats first, did not work in Afghanistan. That is not how things happened. And fortunately, there was a group, us, who looked after women judges, because God only knows nobody else would have at that time.
What was happening in, Afghanistan, that was pretty much a dead system, and it had been choked by corruption, and really during the time of the Taliban, they appointed judges left and right, none of whom were even literate. So, you had no sort of continuity of thought, that was running the court systems. So these judges were not just educated, and literate, but they were committed to justice. And I think nobody's better at doing justice than people who have been the victims of injustice. They asked us if they had to leave, would we help them? Of course we said yes. Of course we'll help you. We had no idea what that would entail. It was incredibly chaotic. There was, 80,000 people in this airport. No one was thinking of immigration. No one was thinking of regulations. No one was, it was the furthest thing from our mind. And the idea was just safety, get people to safety.
Tayeba.
She's one of the younger judges. She's kind of a mover and shaker.
She did an interview very early on, and we were all thinking, what is this woman doing? Is she completely mad? Because she's making herself, the first and obvious target. And she said to me, look, I'm going to be a target, clearly, and maybe publicity will protect me, which was an incredibly brave thing to do.
And I shared my concern during that interview, and I told them that if the Taliban came to Kabul, and our execution, our trial is definite. We rushed to the gate. There was a Talib who beat people, and we waited until morning. We stood up behind the gate for 10 hours, and there was no food.
And then, her battery went flat and she was traveling with her husband. They just got married. And then we lost contact with her.
We were hungry and thirsty, and my father, he told me, for me, it's very important that you leave Afghanistan at any cost.
The people that got through the airport were people that had strong military connections or were young men who could literally push their way through the crowd.
They were going to take them by helicopters, and they were going to take them on buses through different places. And we were on the other end of the phone, listening intently as if we could judge, okay, let's have a reality check here. We can't tell whether or not any of these groups that are suggesting they're going to take them out for 14,000 US a soul or 6 million for the whole group. Really, we were so far out of our depth, we couldn't even imagine it. Yeah.
If we had known military people, I think we could have gotten more judges out, or military people that would be willing to help us. Poland was the only government that sort of talked back. And the Polish Foreign Ministry said that, if we could get judges into the airport, they could assist them. The Polish Special Forces were up on the wall looking for them. And so they had us draw on the hands, P and L for Poland, and then the letter J for judge. So finally the guy said, look, we need to have a code word, and they should put it on, as big as they can on a piece of cardboard. We said, okay, and what should the word be? And this one soldier said, it should be Krakow, because we will never forget. That was the beginning of the Polish connection.
At that time, when I hear that Polish military will help us, I didn't know what kind of country it is and where actually it's located. Polish government has been so supportive to us and helped us a lot. But I felt so sorry. When I relaxed, I thought that I lost all my property or my job, and I cried and told my husband that I'm not a judge anymore. And he said, "Don't say this, and you're my judge forever." Yes, we are safe here, although it's very difficult for us because we are immigrants here, and it's a different culture, a different language. We appear, we look like different from them. For example, our hijab, our scarf is weird for people here in Poland.
To me, it's now the sorrow of being a refugee. You know, everything they owned was taken from them. Their careers are erased. You know, who are they? We thought Anissa was going to come to the US within the first week. 16 months later, she's still in Poland. And it was really tragic because she was truly the RBG of Afghanistan. She not only was their leading spokesperson, I think, on women's rights and women's issues, she was nominated twice to the Afghan Supreme Council, which is our version of the Supreme Court.
Yet I stand before you, stripped of my position as a judge, experiencing, like my sister judges, a difficult and dark time. Women judges are sitting on the edge of the sword. Their role in the enforcement of the rule of law and their work supporting human rights for women and children have made them a target.
You know, we don't really know quite yet how anything is actually going to work when you get here. But what are you worried about?
A study of my nephews and nieces, and also about our life during 1 year and a half. I think it is very active.
You know, that living in a city or in a country that somehow you don't belong to there. You know, living 1.5 years just meaningless. So you just sit all the day at home, just watching Facebook, YouTube, some news, all the bad news. This 1.5 year is just the hardest part of my life.
وظیفه باید بگم که البته وظیفه رسمی من به حیث قاضی تقریبا خاتمه پیدا کردم. در حقیقت ما زمینه را آلموساید باید بسازیم برای جوانا.
I think we had a good lesson today.
Thank you. همین رقمی که قبلا علاقه من بودم که حاکمیت قانون برقرار شود. حالا هم امیدوار به یه هستیم که این حالت که فعلا در افغانستان است و این قانون فعلا در افغانستان است.
We should be optimistic about this. I know that it's very hard situation being an immigrant after working so many years in as a judge, but we can study here, and one day I think we will return to Afghanistan, and I think these brave judges can bring the rule of law and democracy back to people of Afghanistan.
Good afternoon. When we played that film we had at the ceremony on Wednesday night, we had one of the Afghan women judges with us who was going to speak after that film, and we hadn't realised, we should have, how absolutely affecting that was for her. She said that she had she remembered it, brought it all back. She'd been in that airport crush, and she had to just cover her eyes because she couldn't have spoken afterwards if she hadn't done that. So, I mean, it's affecting for anybody, I think, to see that. And can you imagine if you were actually in it? I mean, she's now safe and she's studying at Georgetown for an LLM, but it brought it all back to her. So I don't know if we've got... Just push it? Ah, there we go. So on the 15th of August 2021, a date that's totally indelibly printed on my memory, the Taliban reclaimed Afghanistan's capital city, Kabul, and it placed all of the Afghans who'd supported the democracy-building effort over the past 20 years in mortal danger. Women leaders, including women judges, were in particular danger. At that time, I was a few months into my 2-year term as president of the International Association of Women Judges, or IAWJ as we call it for short. We're dedicated to promoting and empowering women judges, tackling gender bias, promoting access to justice, and generally advancing human rights. Usually we work towards those goals through educational programs and providing support and inspiration to each other. The plight of the Afghan women judges, most of whom were our members, required a small group of IAWJ leaders to become involved in a major humanitarian effort to rescue the women judges and their families. We had no choice but to step up, being well outside of our comfort zone and our normal roles. The values the IAWJ espouses would have seemed empty indeed if we were not prepared to live by them. Our support for the rescue of women judges didn't come out of the blue. The IAWJ's had a very long association with those judges and with the Afghan Women Judges Association. They've attended our biennial and regional conferences over the years, and in 2003, the IAWJ began a cultural and legal exchange program that saw groups of Afghan women judges come to the United States to spend time in Washington, DC and Vermont. And here's a group of one of those groups of Afghan judges visiting the US Supreme Court. And I think you'll no doubt recognise in the group there Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You might ask why Vermont. It was chosen as the other venue for the exchange by happenstance a bit because one of the members of our committee who's still involved is from Vermont. But it was also because of its rural nature, because it more closely resembled the conditions in Afghanistan at the time. And the program in Vermont was interesting because it covered not only legal and court issues, but also had talks from women professionals from other disciplines and cultural visits. And this is a photo of a scout camp. And Judge Anissa Razuli, who was on the film in Poland, who has been called the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of Afghanistan, was visiting this scout camp. And she is the most senior Afghan woman judge, and that was twice nominated, as you heard, for the Supreme Court. On the first occasion, she failed to obtain parliamentary ratification by 6 votes because all the women politicians had been threatened, their lives had been threatened, and they weren't able to be there for the vote. And the second time, the Taliban takeover happened before any vote could be taken. Now, interesting, the little blonde boy who's actually apparently showing Judge Razuli a camp oven is now all grown up and recently married. And he's been a very, very important part of the rescue operation as he set up our database, which has been a vital means of ensuring we have information on all the women judges available when it's needed. So it's a particularly special photo, that one. Now, there were mutual benefits in learning from the Judicial Exchange program, as well as long-lasting friendships. The judges from the US and Afghanistan found they had much in common, especially on issues related to access to justice and gender equality, including within the judiciary itself. But the most significant difference was that the US judges could go to work in conditions of security, unlike their Afghan colleagues. Between 2015 and 2020, it's estimated that more than 300 judges, prosecutors, prison personnel, and other justice sector workers were killed, injured, or abducted, and the Taliban are believed to have been behind many of these attacks. In January 2021, 2 of the Afghan women judges, Judge Zaki Harawi and Judge Qadri Yassini, one of whom had been part of the Vermont-Washington program that we ran, were gunned down and killed on their way to court in Kabul by unknown assailants. Their deaths, of course, were a major tragedy for their families, their loved ones and their colleagues, both in Afghanistan and globally. But this was more than a private tragedy. The killings were part of an orchestrated campaign targeting public figures working towards a more equal and inclusive Afghanistan. Women leaders were especially targeted in an effort to intimidate not only women holding public office, but women more generally. At the IAWJ Biennial Conference, which was held in Auckland in 2021, in May 2021, and because of COVID, it was partly virtual and partly in person, we had 2 Afghan women judges there explaining how insufficient court security had left them vulnerable to violence. And they asked the IAWJ to bring their security situation to the attention of the world and to assist them in facilitating educational programs. And of course, we were very happy to do this. It was very much within our normal IAWJ role. And I have to stress that at this stage, despite the ever-present threat of violence, the Afghan women judges were determined to continue to dedicate themselves to their work as judges and to the country they loved. So these women judges went into work each day not knowing if they would return to their families in the evening, and their courage is beyond belief. But sadly, things took a dramatic turn for the worst when the Taliban reached Kabul in mid-August 2021, and the position of judges at that stage became untenable. That's one of the early photos of the Taliban coming to Kabul, for the second time, obviously. So the idea of women as judges just doesn't fit with the Taliban view of the world. They consider it unacceptable for women to sit in judgment over men or in judgment at all. And in addition, many of the courts the judges sat on were new, and the judges who sat on them were considered hostile agents of foreign powers. What's more, it was not just the Taliban that the women judges had to fear. During their takeover of the country, the Taliban just emptied the prisons of even the worst criminals and terrorists, and many of whom, of course, had been sentenced by our sister judges and were out for revenge. There's also a particularly high risk of revenge attacks from disgruntled litigants in family law cases because they were encouraged by the change in values under the new regime. So this meant that the focus of our small Afghan support committee that we'd set up in order to undertake the educational programs, etc., changed dramatically from support in country to saving the lives of our colleagues and their families by trying to help them leave the country they loved. The Taliban, and in many cases the disgruntled litigants, had access to the judges' addresses and phone numbers through records in the courthouses where the judges used to work. So they were able to use this to hunt the judges and their families down, and most had to go into hiding. As a couple of examples of the dangers the women judges were facing, one judge had fled her home with her family when the Taliban took over. She was very scared they'd come looking for her, and she was right. Their housekeeper, who was still back in the house, was unable to tell the men who came to search where the judge had gone. So in retaliation, they trashed the house and shot the family dog. And the judge has no doubt that if she'd been there, they would have killed her too. Another judge had sat on a custody case involving a child whose father had murdered the child's mother. The child granted custody of the child to the dead woman's family. The father felt that his family should have been granted custody in line with what he saw as Afghan tradition. Released from prison by the Taliban, the father phoned the judge saying he knew where she was. He demanded that she tell him the child's location by the next day. Otherwise, he said, he would kill both the judge and her daughters. Obviously, the judge and her family had to go into hiding. Now, you'll be relieved to know that both of those stories have had happy endings and that they are both now safe with their families and living in Australia. Just to go back, though, over our story and how we became involved and the stages of our work, it's 3 stages, really. The first is before the final withdrawal of foreign troops, followed by a period of air evacuations, and the current period where rescue is becoming more and more difficult, while unfortunately the danger to our judges and their families is getting worse. So once the Taliban had taken Kabul, there were no more commercial flights out of the country. The only option was to secure places on official evacuation flights leaving from Kabul airport, which at that stage was still under US military control, but everything outside the airport was under control of the Taliban. We thought, naively as it turns out, that the obvious dangers these women judges were facing and the important role they'd played in democracy building would guarantee them and their families a place on these evacuation flights. We couldn't have been more wrong. Far from it being women and children first, it seemed to us that it was women and children last. However, we tried very hard during this period to get judges on official flights. We engaged in extensive advocacy efforts, speaking to international media as much as we could to raise awareness of the plight of the women judges, preparing endless lists for officials, which had to be in, every time you'd done a list, somebody asked you for another one in a slightly different form, usually in the middle of the night. Well, at least the middle of the night for us, and contacting governments all over the world, anybody we could think of in an effort to get assistance, but with very limited success. So we only got about 30 of the 250 Afghan judges out of the country at this time. Most of these spots were secured on Polish military aircraft, which is why you saw them in Poland there. And that was after a remarkable advocacy effort from a lawyer in Poland who'd actually read the interview that Tayoba gave and contacted us and said, we can help you if you would like. But even for the judges who were allocated a place on official evacuation flights, actually getting to the airport required determination, luck and fortitude, and you can see the sort of crush of people. Only official vehicles were being let in and out of the airport, so they had to make their way to the airport on foot. The journey took on average about 30 hours through searing heat, immense crushes of people with little food and water, and often with young children. Many had to turn back, and a number of the judges had to seek medical attention for their children as a result of the heat. And one judge's 4-year-old was lost in the crowd for an endless half hour before he was finally found safe and well by neighbours. The Polish authorities mainly used a gateway called the Abbey Gate as the entrance to the airport. To reach this point, the judges had to go through 2 armed checkpoints where they were often forcibly turned away. Tear gas was administered, rifles were shot, luckily mostly up into the air, and people were beaten, including with plastic hoses. And to be fair, I think some of that was crowd control because you can see the sort of crush they were dealing with. The husband of one judge, though, did have a rifle pointed at his head, and needless to say, that family had to turn back. If the judges and their families got past the checkpoints, there was still a harrowing long trip and crush of people to the airport gate. And when we say gate, it doesn't mean the gate to the plane, it means the gate to the airport. And at the end, the families had to wade through what had effectively become a sewer to get close enough to the gate for the Polish soldiers to find them with their J and everything on their hands and get them through into the airport. One judge had to give up at the very last minute as she and her husband just couldn't get their 5 young children through the sewer, and they'd spent the night on a bridge that was near the gate, and they'd had the children trampled on while they slept. Now, you will be relieved to know that that family also got out later in the year, and they're now safe in New Zealand. But our committee members and our wonderful interpreters were with the judges every step of the way to the airport gates. We were encouraging them, giving them directions on one memorable occasion through Google Maps because the judge had gone to the wrong airport entrance and was asking us how they got back to the right one. And we also helped them connect with the soldiers at the gates, which was very important because if the soldiers weren't going to let you in, then there was nothing that could be done. So we had that ability to contact the people inside the airport as well as our judges. As we lived in different time zones, that meant there was always someone awake on a 24-hour Zoom. However, in reality, we all got very little sleep during this time, anxious as we were to ensure that our sister judges made it out safely. And by the end of this period, I felt I could smell the sewer, this is what they're wading through there. The courage, persistence and often luck needed to get into the airport was really something no one should have to endure, and least of all women and children. It was also just outside the Abbey Gate, which is where the Polish authorities were, by that sewer, that the suicide bomb, in fact, I think in the sewer, that the suicide bomb attack happened on the 26th of August, killed almost 200 people. And we had several judges trying to get to the airport that day, so you can imagine the long and very frightening wait until we eventually heard from all of them, and all of them were safe. But that bomb attack basically meant that there were no more flights, and that was the end of the first phase of evacuation. So once the official foreign troops had officially left Afghanistan at the end of August, there were very few remaining official evacuation options. So there was very little action from governments at that stage. They were still some official aspects acting, but mostly to get out citizens of the particular countries that had been left behind, and some military evacuations, but nothing for the judges. It meant that civil society was left with the enormous burden of organising rescues of those who'd not managed to escape in that first period. And to be frank, it's a matter of international shame, I think, that so many people, and in particular so many women who'd worked so hard for democracy and human rights in Afghanistan, were abandoned in this way. So a very small IAWJ committee had to partner with other non-governmental organisations, including wonderful partners like the International Bar Association and Jewish Humanitarian Response, to try and organise evacuations of the remaining 220 or so judges and their families, and we're just immensely grateful for their assistance, and especially because they were able to arrange on-the-ground support in Afghanistan, which we just would not have been able to do on our own. Until the end of 2021, evacuations were through chartered planes, and you can imagine the logistical and funding nightmares and insurance nightmares with that. So it was enormously expensive. So you had to secure landing rights in Afghanistan and in destination countries, working out how to get the judges safely to the airport. And often these planes were landing in transit destinations, which we learnt to call lily pads. Apparently that's the military term for them, where they could wait until visas could be organised. And the two main transit countries were Greece and the United Arab Emirates, but there were also some of our judges in Albania, and they're only now just starting to move from those. But this is a photo of a very relieved judge and her very small baby. They were on the plane to Greece. But this phase was much more successful than the first. We managed to arrange about 130 judges and their families to leave Afghanistan. And we also had people evacuated from other groups, one or two here and there. But we still had to find final destinations for those evacuated judges, and they've only relatively recently begun moving from those transit countries to Canada, and very slowly now the US. And we've got still some 52 judges and their families waiting in those transit destinations in a state of limbo. And you can imagine, as you saw on that video anyway, it's very hard for waiting there, especially for young people and children who are deprived of education while they're there. But we're very grateful to the countries that have offered permanent places to stay. We've got about 148 judges in final destinations, including Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Germany, Spain, Ireland, France, Canada and the US. So, but the second stage came to an abrupt end when we had a failed evacuation flight, and I think we alluded to that on the video. The judges were actually, they'd got up early in the morning, they'd been taken to the airport, they were there with their boarding passes thinking they were getting on the plane. Lots of happy photos of the boarding passes and the judges. Taliban stepped in at the last minute, stopped the flight, arrested and detained about half of the flight. They were released the next day, but it was freezing cold by that stage, and they'd been overnight with really only some bread and water. They weren't very badly treated, but these were young, often with young children, and very, very, very cold, and separated, because half of them were separated from their families. But you can imagine what that was like while we were waiting to find news of them. So now we're in the third stage. We still have about 54 judges and their families in hiding and at risk in Afghanistan, and there's really now no other option but land evacuation. So the focus is on the painstaking task of getting one family out at a time, and at the moment through Pakistan on the whole, when the borders open. And you can just see the distances there. But in Pakistan, there's going to be a wait of about 2 years before being processed for final destinations. We're hoping mostly to the US, but conditions are very basic for them in Pakistan, as we've got very limited funds and waiting's very hard for them, and there remain security concerns in Pakistan itself. And all this comes at a time when conditions in Afghanistan are deteriorating and the dangers to women judges escalating. There have been quite a few systematic searches by the Taliban all the way through. So far, our judges have managed to keep quiet the fact that they were pre-government workers, but there has been some sustained questioning of judges. This has been very frightening. We wake up every morning hoping that this won't be the day that we'll hear that one of them has actually been killed. But as if this wasn't bad enough, restrictions on women generally are tightening every day. So when they first entered Kabul, I don't know whether you remember, they claimed that they were changed, they were a new Taliban, and they would not reinstitute the harsh restrictions on women's rights that existed under the previous regime. Many of the commentators were highly sceptical, us among them in fact, and tragically it turns out we were right. So over the past year, the Taliban have introduced severe restrictions and limitations on women, impacting on every facet of their daily lives. They've replaced the Ministry of Women's Affairs, responsible for progressing women's rights, with the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, a moral police force tasked with taking their rights away. And that's a poster requiring them to, if they go out, to cover themselves absolutely, totally. Girls have been banned from attending secondary school and in fact mostly school generally, and women banned from universities. They can't travel more than 72 kilometres without a male chaperone, and effectively if they do leave the house they have to cover themselves totally, but really they've been told to stay home. So they're at risk whenever they leave the house, and you can imagine this is pretty problematical considering the significant numbers of widows in Afghanistan. It's a country that's been through decades and decades of war. There's recently been a ban on women working in NGOs, which is going to have a major effect on humanitarian aid. As will be unsurprising, this is the Taliban members at the presidential palace, women play no part in the country's leaderships, all dominated by Taliban members. And as one Taliban spokesperson put it, a woman can't be a minister. It's like you put something on her neck that she can't carry. It is not necessary for women to be in the cabinet. They should give birth. So many have labelled this regime gender apartheid, and there's real worries that that persistent dehumanisation will really encourage gender violence, both at the macro and the micro level. Taliban regime has very little respect for the rule of law. There have been widespread reports of arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killings, as well as the return of public whipping. And human rights activists, former government workers and journalists have been particularly targeted. But what's more, there's terrorist attacks by other groups are increasing, and the threat of civil war looms large. And particularly at risk are the minorities like the Hazara community. If this weren't enough, the people of Afghanistan are also suffering in other ways because of natural disasters and the dire economic situation. So about 97% are on the brink of starvation. And you've probably seen the reports of people sending their children of 3 and 4 out to work or selling young children into marriage. So where does this leave us now? We have achieved a lot over the past year and a half, but it's not enough for us. It won't be enough until all of the women are out of Afghanistan. We made a promise that no one would get left behind, and we do intend to try to keep that promise, but it's becoming more and more difficult to achieve. But as our amazing Spanish committee member says at the end of every meeting, we continue. We are very conscious that there are other groups at risk in Afghanistan, but we're a very small group of volunteers and we can't help everyone. So we were a women judges group, and it was obvious that the women judges had the first call on our time. We're also very conscious of the other very real tragedy, being the loss to Afghanistan of so many educated people who would have been able to do so much for their country. Excuse me. But they had no choices. Their lives were in danger. They couldn't stay. There's obviously an amazing sense of relief when the judges finally reached safety. This is a photo of a picnic in New Zealand when a number of the judges accepted by New Zealand had just arrived. It was a lovely day, and we've had a number of occasions both in Australia and in New Zealand since, and I'm especially moved to see the young girls there who will be educated and free to choose whatever career they want and compare what their life would have been in Afghanistan. But there's no doubt that the judges and their families face an uncertain and difficult life as refugees. So they've lost the careers they worked so hard for in countries where they don't speak the language or don't speak it well. They'll face years of hardship and retraining, and many are in fact severely traumatised and with survivor's guilt in many cases, desperately worried about family members and colleagues left behind in Afghanistan. But they are determined women and will no doubt eventually make a huge contribution to the countries they call home. So I'm going to finish just by reflecting very quickly on some lessons learned. First, the power of modern communication. If we hadn't had that, there was no way we could keep in contact with these judges and help them. Second, the power of information. With our database, we were able to provide information on the judges to the people who were trying to do the evacuations and also for visas. Third, the obvious importance of the international networks could coordinate efforts. Without that, it would have been very difficult. And the final lesson, a slightly lighter note, came from our early 24-hour Zoom days in that first phase, and it is never underestimate the power of a group of determined old women in their pyjamas. There have been moments of absolutely great joy. This is just a lovely photo. The man had been in Canada for about a year, and the wife and the 2 little girls were were in Greece, and there was a lot of trouble getting them there. But that was when they first arrived. The older child remembered her father, and she was running towards him, very excited. There have also been periods of pure exhaustion and moments of terrible heartbreak. So at least 2 of our judges have suffered miscarriages, and we recently lost one of our judges in Pakistan to a heart attack, and another died in Afghanistan. And we're not at the end yet. But I need to make it clear, really in finishing, that the real heroines of this story are the Afghan women judges. I'm in absolute awe of their courage and resilience, and I pay tribute to them.
Well, thank you, Justice Glazebrook, for that extraordinary presentation. So I have a few questions for the Justice, which I will ask, but then we'll open it up for Q&A and hopefully have a little time to chat amongst us. So the first question seems, I think, like an impossible question, but it's the first one that comes to mind after watching all of this, which is, how did you have the fortitude and the wherewithal to make all of this happen? I mean, I think as we watch the scenes at the airport, it's impossible to not be incredibly moved by what was happening. And I think most of us would think you have to do something in that moment. And yet, as we know, so many people didn't, right, on the international scene. And yet your organization, with you at the helm of it, did. So can you just talk a little bit about how you thought you could, and how, I mean, we talked about the extraordinary group of women in their pajamas around the clock on Zoom, but how did you think we could do this, and how did you feel that commitment to this group of women?
Well, I probably have to start by saying that we were totally naive, as I say, because we thought all we really needed to do was say, hey, we've got this group of women who are in terrible, terrible danger, who worked hard for democracy. In fact, they've been risking their lives for years working for democracy, for the rule of law, for human rights in their courts. And surely you're going to put them onto the plane. So when we first started, that's what we thought very naively, as it turns out. I think also when you see those scenes on television and you don't know anybody there, I think it can all seem incredibly overwhelming. You can't think of anything that you could possibly do. But remember, we knew a lot of these women. We'd been in contact with them. We'd been talking about them. We'd had them at our conference in May. We'd actually attended a conference, virtually obviously, that they had in Kabul in July. And at that stage, we were talking to them about the education programs we were starting. We were talking about presenting a petition to the Senate. I think they'd written a letter to the Senate that they want, the US Senate, that they wanted us to present. So we were talking about these sort of practical matters, but we were talking to them as individuals. We knew them. Very difficult in those situations to say to people, we can't do anything, but also easier, I think, to think that you might be able to, because you're talking about individual people, you're talking about a group that you know. And I think the other way of doing it, just thinking about it, that the expression that you save one life, you save the world, we didn't really believe it, but it did keep you going, because every person you managed to get on that plane, you managed to get out, at least that person is safe. And we know there's a long way to go, but I think that's the issue. But I think the other lesson is probably, just try and do something, try and work out. And if that doesn't work, try and do something else, and don't think you've got to save the world, because you can save the world one person at a time.
Well, that's, I think, an incredible sentiment, and feeds into this next question, which is, what do we do now? So as we know, at the end, we've seen some of these very hopeful scenes, right, of women judges who are able to get out, and now they're settling in a new country. But of course, as we know, as you mentioned, that's a very difficult process. And Duke at our Bolch Judicial Institute is actually bringing in Judge Parsa, who you saw in the video, to be our first Rule of Law Fellow, precisely so that she has the opportunity to be in this country and to settle with her family, her young daughter and her husband, thanks to the efforts of Melinda, among others. But can you talk a bit about how challenging this next phase is? I know there are difficult issues with bringing somebody in terms of immigration, the visas, things like that. What kinds of challenges do the judges now face, and how can we in these communities be supportive of them?
Well, I think they are going to need a lot of support. Some of them more than others. They are incredibly determined. There's no doubt about that. But can you imagine arriving somewhere with that terrible grief that you have in terms of your country you've had to leave behind, your status, your job, finding yourself somewhere where you don't speak the language? We do have one of our judges in New Zealand has had her qualifications assessed. She's actually starting her requalification as a lawyer process as we speak. I think she's just starting university as we speak. But and I think there's another judge in New Zealand who'll probably start with a husband who was also a judge next year. But for some of them, their English was not at a level where that's even where that's even possible, probably for 2 or 3 years or ever, really. Some of them are in their 50s. The lucky thing is a lot of them were quite young, so they do have that extra career. You saw Taieba. She's got a long career ahead of us. It's a bit unfortunate she'll have to start all over again, but that is possible. But some of the judges in their 50s, it's more difficult. You saw that Anissa Rizzoli, tragically, was talking about the next generation. She's a single judge, but she's actually in charge of, she's actually in charge of some nephews and nieces because their father was killed by the Taliban about a year before. So she's looking to the next generation, which is pretty tragic, given that she had so much to give to the country. So I think getting the rest of them out and that incredible expense while you're waiting, and then the support for them in country, we've got a system where we've got what we call partner judges who are actually helping with the things that are not done by the state. But of course, a lot of the state help is a relatively short period, but not really long enough for them to be totally integrated. So I think there's those two phases.
Wonderful. I think I'll try to sneak in one more question before we move to Q&A if there are folks in the room who have questions for Justice Glazebrook. So, of course, we've been focusing on the IAWJ's remarkable work in Afghanistan, but we know this is not the only country where women judges face real threats. We were talking about Haiti on the way over here. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the other parts of the world where you have real concerns about rule of law, human rights, but particularly then about women in the role of the judiciary and the work that the organization is doing to support those women?
Our normal work, if you like, is very, very focused on actually providing support to women judges, providing encouragement to countries to appoint women judges. That's not necessarily a view that every woman judge is going to be somebody who's going to be working towards gender equality, but just a view that if you do have people in the judiciary that reflect the society that they are serving, one, it's going to be more accepted by the society. That's important for the rule of law. And another aspect of it is you can't be what you can't see, so that it gives that role model. But also many women and other minorities will have experienced things differently, life differently from other people in the judiciary. So that's one of the important issues. The other thing that we have done is to go in education programs into particular countries, to do education programs that are judge-led, but they're also judge-led with a view to a substantive outcome related to fairness, related to access to justice, related especially to gender and other equality. We have just been given a large grant that will enable us to do some more of those programs in the Global South, and so that's what we're concentrating on. So I think that's, and I think we're being told to start Q&A.
Wonderful. So are there questions from the room for Justice Glazebrook? Sure.
Are you doing any work with women in Ukraine?
Interestingly, in Ukraine, we had contact with an association in Europe at the stage. The Ukrainian judges and all of the civil servants were being asked to remain in Ukraine to keep the judicial system and the government going. That was quite hard for some of the women with young children, you can imagine that. But I think all of them felt that that was what they had to do for their country. And so effectively they are there keeping the judicial system and the government system going, which is, again, just incredibly brave.
Yes.
Is there anything that we can do to help you as
It's a great question.
Well, certainly I think in terms of just the resettlement issues in the States, so people have been setting up smaller committees. They've actually been raising money to help with re-education and retraining of people. And in terms of our 54 judges that we've still got in the, it is incredibly expensive because it takes, well, at least it takes up to about 2 years before they can be processed. They're living in quite basic conditions at the moment. So generally, those two aspects of help could be helpful.
Wonderful. Other questions from the group? Yes.
You're essentially the leader of, large bar association. How on earth did you motivate some of your members to become involved in such a deep effort that was so out of their comfort zone?
Right, not what anybody signed up for, presumably.
No, as I say, we had this very, very small committee that was set up, and we thought we were actually going to just be supporting them with these educational programs, and it's been that very, very small committee that's been working all the way through. It's not that we haven't had the support. We've obviously had the support from the board. We couldn't just do this without actually making sure that the organisation was behind it. But I think it was, and the story itself, of course, is a very, very compelling story. It's very difficult, I think, to say, look, we shouldn't do anything. It's difficult to know what you can do, but it's also just about impossible if you're an organisation that's supposed to be supporting women judges to say, we don't care, we're not going to do anything. So, but it's a very, very small group, I have to say, and 4 of them were here in Duke. You can see the sort of dedication because, I travelled from New Zealand, my colleague travelled from Australia, another from Canada, 2 from elsewhere in the States. Only 2 didn't come, one who's in England and one's in Spain. They couldn't get time off. So it's a very, very small group, but very, very dedicated.
Yes.
How many different countries did you have to ask for help before Poland stepped up?
We were mainly contacting anybody, and especially my US colleagues, anybody they knew in the States, because that was the United States were the main people who were taking people out. We also had some support from Spain through our amazing Spanish colleague, the We Continue person, and the UK took out a number of the judges as well. So by the time New Zealand and Australia, I think, weren't really, they were begging places on the other people's, they weren't putting, I don't think they were sending planes in directly as such. They were begging places on other, the Canadians, I don't think, we were trying with Canada as well. We tried absolutely everything that we possibly could, to be honest, and it was, and the worst thing was doing lists. One of my colleagues, my Australian colleague, says she's never even going to do a shopping list after having done lists and lists and lists, and they were all in a different format. They all had to be done the day before yesterday. It was unbelievable.
Yes.
I heard you say, thank you. I heard you say also in the film that women and children were not being prioritized getting out of Afghanistan. And I'm curious what you were told at the time about who was being prioritized.
That who was, sorry?
Who was being prioritized by the military?
Look, quite obviously, and actually understandably, when I can look back on it and be calm about it, it was people who had directly worked for the foreign troops, so people like the interpreters, etc. One of the issues with the judges and women's organisations was that actually quite rightly during the period where there was the foreign troop, where there were the foreign powers there, they'd been encouraged to set up their own organisations. The courts had been there. They weren't being paid for, well, some of them were being funded by the place, but they were supposed to be independent because judges are supposed to be independent in courts. They're not employees. They're not directly helping. And so when you think about it, that was the real issue, that these women's groups, they were being funded, but they were independent and should have been independent. But of course, when it came to saying who was coming, and of course, a lot of the people who had directly helped the military, they didn't get out either. And that's one of the things that we've found, that middle level military people have been incredibly helpful to us because they felt that they'd been let down because people who directly helped them, people in fact who'd saved their lives, they felt, were not being prioritised and got out of Afghanistan. So they understood totally that we felt the same about our colleagues and have been incredibly helpful. And you know, the authorities have been much more helpful. After that initial stage, it was just, I mean, it was chaos. It was total chaos. We of course, didn't feel, we weren't able to look back. We weren't able to feel like that at the time. We felt unbelievably frustrated. But when we're looking back now, it was a chaotic time. And it is quite understandable that this happened. It just was unfortunate that it was the women that didn't make it through at that time.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
I'm just curious if you can speak to the 70 judges that did not get out, or that, like, are they still in hiding? Do you have any idea what's going on there? Are they trying to get out?
We're still trying to get them out. One of the problems is that a number of them still haven't got passports. The passport office closes at the moment. I think it might be open. Some of them are getting renewed passports now, but that's only if they'd put in applications way before. So there's a passport issue with them. A lot of them, they are still in hiding. Some of their husbands are still able to work, not as judges obviously, but as something else. Some of them have savings, I think, that enables them, and relatives that enable them. But we, every morning, I've made a point every morning of making sure that I answer absolutely everybody who asks me what an issue is, that I talk to all of them if they, we've tried to arrange medical help for some of the people and have been able to do that, for instance. So we're in contact with them every day now still. And a lot of them are very, very scared and very, very traumatised. And it's apparently that's when some of the people have got out, they've said that was the thing that actually kept them going. That even if I gave them an answer that said, we don't have any news, we'll let you know as soon as we can, that gave them hope, because at least it meant somebody was still thinking about them and somebody was still trying to do something. It's something very little, and hopefully we can do more than that. Hopefully we do get them out.
Well, I think I can speak for everyone here to say we are incredibly grateful for and inspired by the work of the IAWJ and everything that you have done to make all of this possible. So thank you, Justice Glazebrook. This has been an honor to get to talk to you today. Thank you.